That is what is beating us. Those 7 words, spoken by a captured German pilot in January of 1945, revealed more about the outcome of World War II than 1,000 battle reports ever could. The pilot stood in an American headquarters building at a muddy airfield in eastern France, pointing through the window at a row of factory-fresh P-47 Thunderbolts that had arrived just days earlier. His captors had brought him back to see something. Where twisted wreckage and burning fuel had covered the tarmac less than a week before, where his comrades had destroyed 22 American fighters in a devastating surprise attack, there now sat gleaming replacement aircraft as if nothing had happened at all. The German looked at those planes and understood in that moment what his commanders had refused to accept for years. Germany could win every battle in the sky and still lose the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the most formidable fighter aircraft ever built. Designed by Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who had become one of America's premier aircraft engineers at Republic Aviation, the Thunderbolt was a massive machine compared to its contemporaries. It weighed nearly 8 tons, fully loaded, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, earning nicknames like the Jug, short for Juggernaut. The aircraft measured over 12 meters in wingspan and stood nearly 4.5 meters tall on its landing gear. Its distinctive profile, with that enormous radial engine and bubble canopy, made it instantly recognizable to friend and foe alike. The heart of the Thunderbolt was its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine, an 18-cylinder power plant that produced over 2,000 horsepower in its later variants, reaching 2,300 horsepower at war emergency power. This engine drove a massive 4-blade propeller, nearly 4 meters in diameter. The aircraft could reach speeds approaching 700 kilometers per hour in level flight, and could climb to altitudes above 12,000 meters. 8 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns protruded from the wings, 4 on each side, capable of firing a devastating volume of fire at enemy aircraft or ground targets. The Thunderbolt could carry up to 1,100 kilograms of bombs or rockets beneath its wings, making it equally effective as a fighter and a ground attack aircraft. What made the P-47 truly remarkable was its ruggedness. The design philosophy that Kartveli employed prioritized survivability in ways that other aircraft designers had not considered. The radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, could absorb tremendous punishment and continue running. A liquid-cooled inline engine, like those used in German Messerschmitts and British Spitfires, would fail catastrophically if a single bullet punctured its cooling system. The air-cooled radial could lose multiple cylinders and still generate enough power to bring its pilot home. Stories circulated throughout the 8th and 9th Air Forces of Thunderbolts, returning with damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Pilots came back with entire sections of wing shot away, with cylinders punctured, with control surfaces shredded by flak. The ground crews loved the aircraft because it could be repaired with relative ease in field conditions. Parts were interchangeable. Damaged components could be cannibalized from wrecked airframes to keep other aircraft flying. This was not an accident of design. Republic Aviation had built the P-47 to survive the brutal realities of industrial warfare. By the end of World War II, American factories would produce more than 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts, making it the most produced American fighter aircraft in history. This single statistic represented something far greater than manufacturing efficiency. It represented a fundamental transformation in how nations waged war. The United States had converted its peacetime industrial capacity into a military production machine of unprecedented scale. Automobile factories now built aircraft engines. Refrigerator plants manufactured gun turrets. Typewriter companies produced machine guns. Women who had never worked outside the home took positions on assembly lines, joining millions of workers in a national effort that touched nearly every family in America. The Republic Aviation plant at Farmingdale on Long Island became a model of wartime production efficiency. Workers operated in 3 shifts around the clock. The assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford were adapted for aircraft manufacturing. At peak production, the factory turned out over 600 Thunderbolts per month. Raw aluminum arrived at one end of the facility, and completed fighters emerged at the other, ready for delivery to modification centers where combat equipment would be installed before the aircraft were shipped overseas. The financing of this industrial miracle came from war bonds purchased by ordinary citizens. Movie stars toured the country, urging Americans to buy bonds. School children collected scrap metal and rubber. Factory workers donated portions of their paychecks. The arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin Roosevelt called it, was not merely a government program. It was a collective undertaking that drew upon the resources and sacrifices of an entire nation. Every thunderbolt that rolled off the assembly line at Farmingdale represented not just military might, but the accumulated effort of miners who dug the ore, steel workers who forged the metal, workers who riveted the fuselage, and families who purchased the bonds that paid for it all. Getting those aircraft from American factories to European battlefields required a logistical system of staggering complexity. Two main ferry routes crossed the Atlantic Ocean. The northern route brought aircraft through Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, and finally to Scotland. The southern route passed through Brazil, crossed to West Africa, and continued through Morocco to the Mediterranean or Britain. Along these routes, staging bases provided fuel, maintenance, and crew rest facilities. In England, the massive Base Air Depot at Burtonwood in Lancashire employed over 18,000 servicemen who processed more than 15,000 aircraft during the course of the war. Aircraft arrived, partially assembled, were fitted with combat equipment, test-flown, and delivered to operational squadrons. The entire system operated with the efficiency of a conveyor belt, moving aircraft from factory to front line in a matter of weeks. In the final months of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Allied forces had broken out of Normandy in August and swept across France with stunning speed. The hedgerow fighting that had cost so many lives in June and July gave way to a war of movement. Paris was liberated on August 25. By September, Allied armies had pushed to the borders of Germany itself. The port of Antwerp fell to British forces, though the approaches through the Scheldt estuary remained in German hands until November. The end of the war seemed within reach. Some optimistic planners predicted victory by Christmas. American newspapers ran headlines suggesting the fighting would be over within weeks, but the German military was far from finished. Adolf Hitler had been husbanding his remaining armoured divisions and Luftwaffe fighter squadrons for one final counterstroke that would shock the Western Allies and perhaps change the course of the war. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was audacious to the point of fantasy. 3 German armies would attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, the same region where German forces had achieved their stunning breakthrough in 1940. The objective was to split the British and American armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. With the Western Front stabilized, Germany could then concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the east. On December 16, 1944, the German offensive burst through the Ardennes forest with complete tactical surprise. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 soldiers supported by approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, smashed into thinly held American lines. Green divisions that had never seen combat found themselves facing veteran panzer formations. For the first several days, bad weather grounded Allied aircraft, negating the overwhelming air superiority that had made Allied ground operations so successful. German panzer divisions raced westward toward the Meuse River, capturing thousands of American prisoners and threatening to split the Allied armies in two. The bulge that formed in the American lines gave the battle its name. The Luftwaffe had been notably absent during the early days of the offensive, conserving its remaining strength for a coordinated blow that would come later. German air commanders had been secretly assembling the largest fighter force they could muster for an operation codenamed Bodenplatte, meaning baseplate in English. The plan had been in development since November, though security concerns kept the details closely guarded. Many pilots would not learn their targets until the morning of the attack. The operation called for a massive surprise attack on Allied tactical airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. More than 900 German fighters would strike 16 to 17 airfields simultaneously at dawn on New Year's Day, catching the Allies recovering from their holiday celebrations. If successful, the operation would destroy hundreds of Allied fighters and fighter bombers on the ground, crippling the tactical air forces that supported the ground armies. This would give the Ardennes offensive the air cover it needed to succeed, and perhaps turn the tide of the war in the West. The man who would lead the attack on the American airfield at Metz in eastern France was Oberstleutnant Helmut Bennemann, commander of Jagdgeschwader 53, known by its emblem as Picas, the Ace of Spades. Bennemann was an experienced combat pilot who had flown on the Eastern Front, in the Mediterranean, and now in the defense of the Reich. His Geschwader had a distinguished history dating back to the pre-war Luftwaffe, and its pilots included several decorated veterans with multiple confirmed victories. For Bodenplatte, his unit would be assigned the southernmost target in the operation, the only airfield in France, rather than the Low Countries. Designated Y-34 by the Allies, the Metz-Frescaty airfield was home to the 365th Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces, known informally as the Hellhawks. The 365th Fighter Group had arrived in England in late December of 1943, establishing themselves at Gosfield in Essex, and entered combat in February of 1944, flying fighter escort and interdiction missions over occupied Europe. Their P-47 Thunderbolts had provided vital fighter cover for the D-Day invasion beaches during those critical first hours, when the success of the entire operation hung in the balance. As the campaign progressed and Allied ground forces pushed inland, the group transitioned to ground attack missions that would become their specialty. The work was dangerous in ways that aerial combat was not. Flying at treetop level against heavily defended targets, the pilots faced a constant barrage of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with tracers and shrapnel. The group specialized in close air support, the difficult and deadly art of striking enemy positions just ahead of advancing friendly troops. Their aircraft struck German armored columns, attempting to reinforce the Normandy defenses. They bombed bridges to cut supply lines. They attacked rail yards and supply depots. They strafed locomotives, until German train crews learned to fear the sound of approaching aircraft engines. They dropped bombs on strongpoints that pinned down American infantry, sometimes releasing their ordnance just hundreds of meters from friendly positions. This required precise navigation, steady nerves, and complete trust between air and ground forces. The Hellhawks had earned their nickname through aggressive tactics that brought them into the teeth of German anti-aircraft defenses day after day. Flak claimed more of their pilots than enemy fighters did. The Luftwaffe was rarely seen over the front lines by late 1944, but the German anti-aircraft gunners were skilled and numerous. Every mission meant running a gauntlet of fire. The pilots who survived learned to jink and weave, to vary their approaches, to never fly straight and level in the target area. Some did not learn fast enough. By late December 1944, the group was operating from the captured German airfield at Metz-Frescaty, a facility that had served the Luftwaffe earlier in the war. The field lay in the Moselle Valley in northeastern France, surrounded by low hills that would play a crucial role in the attack to come. The pilots lived in tents and makeshift quarters, dealing with the harsh winter weather that had settled over the region. Mud was everywhere. Maintenance was a constant struggle in the freezing temperatures. Aircraft engines had to be preheated before starting. Hydraulic fluid grew sluggish in the cold, but morale remained high. The Hellhawks knew they were winning the war. The Battle of the Bulge was a setback, certainly, but few doubted that the Allies would eventually prevail. New Year's Eve, 1944, passed quietly at Metz-Frescaty. The pilots and ground crews celebrated as best they could, given the circumstances. Some had managed to acquire bottles of champagne or local wine. Others simply gathered in heated tents to play cards and talk about home. The weather had been poor for days, limiting flying operations. Low clouds and fog had grounded many missions, forcing the pilots to wait impatiently for conditions to improve. There had been reports of German activity in the Ardennes, but the situation seemed to be stabilizing. American forces had held at key points. Bastogne remained in Allied hands despite being surrounded. The German advance was slowing. Here at Metz, far from the Bulge, the war felt almost distant on that final night of 1944. As midnight approached, the men of the 365th Fighter Group toasted the coming year. 1945 would surely bring victory. Everyone knew the Germans were beaten. It was only a matter of time. The pilots who had survived the brutal fighting since the previous winter allowed themselves to imagine returning home, seeing their families, resuming the lives that had been interrupted by war. Parents, wives, sweethearts, children. These were the people they fought for. These were the people who waited for letters that arrived weeks after they were written. No one at Metz-Frescaty could have known that hundreds of kilometers to the east, German pilots were receiving final briefings for the largest Luftwaffe operation since the Battle of Britain. No one could have imagined what the first morning of 1945 would bring. The morning of January 1st, 1945 dawned cold and grey over Metz-Frescaty. Frost covered the parked aircraft, turning them white in the early light. Ground crews began their morning routines, checking engines and preparing aircraft for the day's missions. Mechanics ran up engines to warm them. Armourers checked ammunition belts and bomb loads. In the operations tent, officers planned the day's sorties while sipping hot coffee. Two of the group's three squadrons, the 387th and 388th Fighter Squadrons, would launch early with full bomb loads for ground attack missions against German positions. The 386th Fighter Squadron, commanded by Major George Brooking, would fly later in the morning after the first wave returned. By 9 o'clock, the Thunderbolts of the 387th and 388th Squadrons had taken off and were heading toward their targets. The throaty roar of their engines had faded into the distance. The pilots of the 386th Squadron were walking toward their aircraft across the frozen mud, preparing for their own missions. The airfield was busy with the normal activity of a fighter base at war. Mechanics worked on engines in the cold. Armourers loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition. Fuel trucks moved between the hard stands where the silver P-47s waited in neat rows. It was just another winter morning at a forward airfield. Cold, busy, routine. Then the sky filled with German fighters. They came in low from the north, sweeping over the hills surrounding the airfield at treetop height. Messerschmitt 109s, dozens of them, their engines screaming as they drove toward the parked aircraft. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 53 had navigated to their target using roads and rivers as landmarks, flying so low that they were beneath the coverage of radar stations. The element of surprise was complete. There was no warning, no air raid sirens, no time to scramble aircraft or man defensive positions. The German pilots had caught the Americans exactly as planned. Machine gun and cannon fire raked the flight line. The leading Messerschmitts opened up with their 13mm machine guns and 20mm cannons, sending streams of tracers across the hard stands where the P-47s sat fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. The first explosions came almost immediately. A Thunderbolt's fuel tank ignited, sending a column of black smoke and orange flame into the grey morning sky. Then another aircraft caught fire. And another. The bombs loaded beneath the aircraft wings began to detonate, adding their devastating force to the inferno. Each explosion set off chain reactions as fuel and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. Pilots and ground crew members dove for cover wherever they could find it. Some threw themselves into foxholes hastily dug around the perimeter. Others crawled beneath vehicles or pressed themselves against the frozen earth. Men caught in the open sprinted for any protection they could find while bullets cracked past their heads. The German fighters swept across the field in strafing runs, pulled up in steep climbing turns, and came back for another pass from the opposite direction. The roar of engines mixed with the thunder of explosions and the crack of machine gun fire. The smell of burning aviation fuel filled the air. The carefully arranged rows of aircraft became a scene of devastation. Major Brooking watched from a slit trench as his squadron's aircraft burned. Each explosion represented not just a machine worth over $80,000, but the countless hours of labor that had built it, the training of the pilot who would have flown it, the missions that would now go unfulfilled. The Germans were thorough and determined. They returned again and again, methodically working their way across the airfield, destroying every aircraft they could find. Some pilots made 3 or 4 strafing passes before climbing away to the east. The anti-aircraft guns on the airfield perimeter opened fire, sending streams of tracers into the sky. Quad-mounted .50 caliber machine guns and 40mm Bofors cannons swept the low-flying attackers with deadly effectiveness. Some rounds found their marks. A Messerschmitt, trailing smoke and flame, ploughed into a field beyond the runway, cartwheeling in a ball of fire. Another exploded in mid-air as its ammunition or fuel ignited from anti-aircraft hits. But the volume of defensive fire was limited, especially in the critical first minutes when surprise was complete. The German pilots pressed their attacks with determined aggression despite their losses. 12 P-47s from the 367th Fighter Squadron of the 358th Fighter Group happened to be airborne near Metz when the attack began. Returning from an escort mission, These pilots spotted the German formations heading toward the airfield and dove to intercept. In the wild melee that followed, the American pilots claimed 13 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single one of their own. The unit would later receive the Distinguished Unit Citation for this action. But their intervention came too late to prevent the destruction on the ground. For 15 minutes, that seemed to last hours, the airfield was a scene of chaos and destruction. Finally, the last German fighters climbed away and disappeared to the east, their ammunition expended and fuel running low. The sudden silence seemed almost more shocking than the noise had been. Smoke rose from burning aircraft across the field. Ammunition continued to cook off in the fires, sending rounds cracking in random directions. Wounded men called for medics. The acrid smell of burning rubber, oil, and aviation fuel hung heavy in the winter air. When the damage assessment was completed, the extent of the destruction became clear. 22 P-47 Thunderbolts had been destroyed. 11 more had been badly damaged, but might be salvageable. The 386th Fighter Squadron had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. At least 11 personnel had been wounded in the attack. The hard stands that had held neat rows of silver fighters now held only twisted wreckage and smouldering debris. Among the casualties was a German pilot whose Messerschmitt had been hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed near the Command airfield. He had survived the crash landing and was quickly captured by American personnel who found him attempting to evade. Unlike some prisoners who might have been shocked or demoralized by their capture, this pilot was defiant. He spoke excellent English and made no effort to hide his satisfaction at the destruction surrounding him. When he was brought to the group headquarters building for initial interrogation, he looked out the window at the burning wreckage of the American fighters and turned to Major Brooking with a smug expression. "What you think of that?" he asked. Brooking said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence of German success was burning on the tarmac. The pilot had every reason to be confident. In a single morning, his Geschwader had destroyed an entire squadron's worth of American aircraft. The operation appeared to have achieved everything it intended. The losses the Americans had suffered would take weeks or months to replace. Or so the German believed. But the story was far from over. Even as fires still burned on the airfield, the ground crews of the 365th Fighter Group began the work of recovery. These were the men who rarely appeared in official histories, the mechanics and armourers and fuel handlers who kept aircraft flying. They were the unsung heroes of the air war, working long hours in difficult conditions to maintain complex machines. Working with methodical efficiency, even as smoke still rose from the wreckage, the maintenance personnel began assessing the damage. Some aircraft were total losses, nothing but burned-out hulks of aluminum and steel. Others had been damaged, but might be salvageable with enough work. The crews began cannibalizing parts from the wrecked Thunderbolts, removing undamaged components that could be used to repair the aircraft that had survived. Engines were checked. Flight controls were tested. Fuel lines were inspected. Anything that could fly again would fly again. By that same afternoon, the 365th Fighter Group was already flying again. The two squadrons that had been airborne during the attack returned safely to find their base transformed into a scene of devastation, but there was no time for mourning. The pilots immediately shared their aircraft with the men of the devastated 386th Squadron. Men who had watched their own planes burn in the morning were airborne by evening, flying borrowed Thunderbolts on combat missions. The Hell Hawks were not finished. They had absorbed a devastating blow and continued fighting within hours. But the real demonstration of American industrial power came in the days that immediately followed the attack. Requests for replacement aircraft had been transmitted even before the fires were extinguished. The supply pipeline that stretched from factories in the United States through modification centers and across the Atlantic to depots in England and France began to respond with remarkable speed. This was not improvisation. This was a system designed from the beginning to absorb losses and continue operations. The journey of a replacement Thunderbolt began at the Republic Aviation factory in Farmingdale, where workers assembled the aircraft from thousands of individual components. After testing, the aircraft was disassembled just enough to fit aboard a cargo ship or flown by ferry pilots across the Atlantic. The northern route through Greenland and Iceland brought aircraft to Scotland. The southern route through Brazil and West Africa brought them to North Africa or the Mediterranean. Upon arrival in Britain, The aircraft went to modification centers where combat equipment was installed, radios calibrated, guns harmonized, and camouflage paint applied. Then the aircraft were flown to forward airfields and delivered directly to the units that needed them. Within days, not weeks, brand new P-47 Thunderbolts began arriving at Metz-Frescaty. These aircraft were fresh from the factory. Their silver paint gleamed in the winter sunlight. Their engines had never been run at full power in combat. They had been built in Farmingdale, shipped across the ocean, assembled and tested in England, and delivered to a combat airfield in France in less time than it took for the German prisoner to be processed and interrogated. Major Brooking decided to make a point. He went to the holding area where the captured German pilot was still being detained and arranged to bring him back to the group headquarters. Together they stood at the same window where, days earlier, the German had gloated over the destruction he had helped cause. But now the view was different. Where burned and twisted wreckage had littered the hardstands, rows of factory-fresh Thunderbolts sat ready for combat. The 365th Fighter Group was back to full strength, as if the attack had never happened. Brooking pointed out the window and asked the German pilot the same question he had been asked days before. "What do you think of that?" The German's arrogance was gone. He stared at the new aircraft, understanding finally what he was seeing. This was not merely an air force recovering from a tactical setback. This was an industrial civilization operating at a scale that Germany could never match. For every aircraft destroyed, America could build 3 more. For every pilot killed, 10 more were completing training. The mathematics of attrition that German commanders had calculated so carefully had one fatal flaw. They had assumed both sides were playing by the same rules. They were not. "That is what is beating us," the German said. What the captured pilot witnessed at Metz-Frescaty was a microcosm of the larger reality that doomed Nazi Germany from the moment America entered the war. The United States produced 295,959 military aircraft during World War II. In 1944 alone, American factories built 96,270 aircraft, a number that exceeded Japan's total production for the entire war. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a completed B-24 Liberator heavy bomber rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. The plant was so large that visitors compared it to a small city, with its own power station, fire department, and medical facilities. The main assembly building stretched nearly a kilometer in length, and at peak production, over 42,000 workers labored there around the clock. B-17 Flying Fortress production peaked at 362 aircraft per month in early 1944. The P-51 Mustang, which would become the premier American escort fighter, saw more than 15,500 produced by war's end. Through innovations in assembly line techniques and worker training, the same workforce could produce dramatically more aircraft by the end of the war than they could at the beginning. This represented the full mobilization of American industrial society for total war. The industrial capacity that produced these aircraft was itself a weapon of war. German planners had understood this in the abstract, but failed to grasp its practical implications. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 1943 had demonstrated the problem with terrible clarity. The 8th Air Force launched a deep penetration bombing raid against the German ball-bearing industry at Schweinfurt, combined with an attack on the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The combined losses were catastrophic. 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses were shot down across both targets, with many more damaged beyond repair. The mission proved that unescorted heavy bombers could not survive deep penetration raids over the Reich. In October, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt alone. The second raid, known as Black Thursday, resulted in another 60 B-17s lost. Nearly 600 American airmen were reported missing in action in a single day. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions into Germany for months afterward. German commanders celebrated these defensive victories. They had demonstrated that the American bombing campaign could be defeated by determined fighter opposition. They believed they had found the solution to the strategic air threat, but within weeks, the American bomber force had replaced its losses and resumed operations. Within months, the P-51 Mustang escort fighter arrived in theater, capable of accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang changed everything. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it the range that previous American fighters lacked. Now the bombers would not fly alone. By February of 1944, during the campaign known as Big Week. The 8th Air Force alone lost 137 heavy bombers in just 5 days of intensive operations against the German aircraft industry. Combined Allied losses during that week exceeded 350 aircraft. 1 week later, American bombers attacked Berlin for the first time. The losses that would have crippled the force in 1943 had become sustainable in 1944. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdgeschwader, responsible for German fighter operations, watched this progression with growing despair. He later recorded his observations in his memoir The First and the Last, noting that by the spring of 1944, the enemy outnumbered his fighters by ratios of 6-1 and even 8-1. The quality of American pilot training, he admitted, was astonishingly high. Meanwhile, his own force was bleeding irreplaceable veterans at a catastrophic rate. Between January and April of 1944, over 1,000 German fighter pilots were killed. Galland lost half his available fighters in those 4 months. Half of the survivors fell in the months that followed. The problem was not aircraft production. German industry actually increased fighter output dramatically in 1944, turning out nearly 40,000 aircraft that year despite the bombing. Albert Speer's dispersal program had moved factories into small workshops and underground facilities where they were harder to target. Production actually peaked in the autumn of 1944. The problem was pilots. Training a competent fighter pilot required hundreds of flight hours and years of experience. The abbreviated programs that German training commands were forced to adopt produced pilots who were sent into combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. Their American opponents had 3 times that amount or more. The result was predictable and tragic. Young German pilots were being killed at rates that made replacement impossible. Galland noted grimly that most of these pilots were lost during the first 5 combat missions. They simply did not have the experience to survive against well-trained enemies who outnumbered them. The veterans who had learned their trade over years of combat found themselves increasingly alone, surrounded by replacement pilots who did not know how to fight and did not live long enough to learn. Günther Rall, the 3rd highest-scoring ace in history with 275 confirmed victories, later reflected on the staggering losses his comrades suffered. Heinz Knoke, who chronicled the air war in his memoir titled I Flew for the Führer, recorded facing 1,000 bomber formations with just 40 fighters. Every time I close the canopy, he wrote, I feel that I am closing the lid of my own coffin. The psychological burden of flying into certain death day after day, watching comrades fall and knowing that the odds grew worse with each mission, broke many pilots before enemy fire could claim them. Hans Philipp, commander of Jagdgeschwader, one with 206 confirmed victories, wrote to a former comrade named Hannes Trautloft on the Eastern Front in October of 1943. Against 20 Russians trying to shoot you down, or even 20 Spitfires, it can be exciting, even fun, he wrote. But curve in toward 40 fortresses, and all your past sins flash before your eyes. 4 days after writing those words, Philipp was killed in action against American heavy bombers over Bremen. He was 26 years old. This was the context in which Operation Bodenplatte was conceived and executed. German planners hoped that destroying Allied aircraft on the ground would bypass the disadvantage their pilots faced in aerial combat. If American fighters could be caught sitting on their airfields, poorly trained German pilots would not need to engage them in dogfights they would likely lose. The more than 900 fighters assembled for Bodenplatte represented virtually everything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. It was a desperate gamble, the kind of operation that only made sense for a force that had already lost the war of attrition. Across the airfields targeted on January 1, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte destroyed approximately 305 Allied aircraft and damaged nearly 200 more. As a single-day tactical achievement, it was significant. German planners could point to these numbers as evidence of success. But the operational reality was far grimmer than the destruction inflicted. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft during Bodenplatte, with 143 pilots killed or missing, 70 captured, and 21 wounded. This represented the largest single-day loss of pilots in Luftwaffe history. Among the casualties were 3 Geschwader Commodore, 5 Gruppenkommandeur, and 14 Staffelkapitan. These were unit commanders, the experienced leaders who trained new pilots, who developed tactics, who held units together in combat. Their loss was irreplaceable. 22 unit leaders gone in a single morning. No factory could produce replacements for them. Jagdgeschwader, 53, the unit that attacked Metz-Frescaty, exemplified the cost of the operation. Of the approximately 80 aircraft that participated in the attack, 38 were destroyed or damaged. 13 pilots were killed or missing. 3 were killed over the target. 4 were captured, including the pilot who would deliver those 7 memorable words. 3 were wounded. This represented a loss rate approaching half, a figure that would be catastrophic for any military unit and utterly unsustainable over time. Meanwhile, every Allied aircraft destroyed during Bodenplatte was replaced within a week. The logistical infrastructure that moved aircraft from American factories to European airfields continued operating without interruption. The pilots who survived the attacks returned to flying within hours. The overall impact on Allied tactical air power was negligible. Within days, American and British fighter bombers were back over German lines in full force, continuing the relentless interdiction campaign that strangled German supply lines and made daylight movement impossible. Historian Werner Gerbig, in his study of the Luftwaffe's final months, described Bodenplatte as dealing the German fighter force a mortal blow. The phrase was not rhetorical exaggeration. After the operation, several Jagdgeschwader were immediately transferred to the collapsing Eastern Front, leaving almost no fighter defense in the West. The Luftwaffe would never again mount a major offensive operation. The air war over Europe was effectively over, decided not by any single battle but by the cumulative weight of industrial production that no amount of German skill or courage could overcome. The captured pilot at Metz-Frescaty had understood this truth in a way that his superiors in Berlin refused to accept until it was far too late. Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, had dismissed American industrial capacity early in the war with the observation that Americans could not build airplanes, suggesting they were only good at making refrigerators and razor blades. When presented with evidence that American P-47 fighters were appearing deep inside German airspace, Göring refused to believe the reports. He called them the rantings of a worn-out defeatist and insisted the American fighters must have glided into Germany after running out of fuel at altitude. When Galland asked why any Allied pilot would choose to glide toward Germany rather than toward home, Göring had no answer. The denial continued until reality made it impossible to ignore. When P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin in March of 1944, escorting bombers all the way to the German capital and back, even Göring had to admit the implications. In his post-war interrogation, he acknowledged that long-range escort fighters were one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. But by the time German leadership accepted this reality, it was far too late to change anything. The war of attrition had already been lost. The airfield at Metz-Frescaty continued operations without interruption after the Bodenplatte attack. By January 30th, 1945, the 365th Fighter Group had relocated to a new base at Florennes in Belgium, closer to the front lines where they could more effectively support the ground forces. The Hellhawks continued flying combat missions until the end of the war, supporting the final Allied push into Germany. Their official history records hundreds of enemy vehicles destroyed, dozens of locomotives wrecked, countless missions flown in support of ground forces. The attack of January 1st, 1945, became one incident among many, a dramatic morning that ultimately changed nothing about the war's outcome. The captured German pilot, whose words gave meaning to that morning, disappears from the historical record after his initial interrogation. The exchange between the pilot and Major Brooking was recorded by historians Robert F. Dorr and Thomas D. Jones in their book Hell Hawks, based on interviews with surviving members of the 365th Fighter Group. Secondary sources identify the captured pilot as Oberfeldwebel Stefan Kohl of Jagdgeschwader 53, the pilot of White 11, shot down and captured at Metz-Frescaty. He was likely transferred to a prisoner of war camp somewhere in France or England, where he would have waited out the remaining months of the war alongside thousands of his countrymen. Whether he survived to return home to Germany after the surrender is unknown. What matters is not his ultimate fate, but what he recognized in that moment. Looking at those factory-fresh Thunderbolts lined up on the tarmac, he saw the truth that German strategic planning had refused to acknowledge for years. The story of the Metz-Frescaty attack offers a different kind of war narrative than the tales of heroic combat that dominate popular memory. There are no aces dueling in the sky here, no dramatic last stands against overwhelming odds. Instead, there is something perhaps more significant. A moment of clarity in which a defeated enemy recognized the nature of his defeat. The German pilot had done everything right. His unit had achieved tactical surprise. They had destroyed their targets. They had accomplished their mission, and none of it mattered. This is the fundamental reality of industrial warfare that emerged from World War II and continues to shape military thinking today. Individual courage and skill remain essential. Training and tactics still determine the outcome of individual engagements. But beneath these human factors lies a deeper truth about the capacity of nations to sustain prolonged conflict. Wars are won by the side that can replace its losses faster than the enemy can replace theirs. This was true in 1945, and it remains true in the modern age of precision-guided weapons and advanced technology. The nation that can manufacture, deploy, and maintain the most equipment will prevail, assuming it has the will to continue fighting. The P-47 Thunderbolts that lined the ramp at Metz-Frescaty in January of 1945 represented this truth in physical form. Each aircraft was the product of thousands of hours of labor by workers in factories and mines and shipyards across the United States. Each carried within its airframe the accumulated knowledge of engineers and designers who had solved countless technical problems. Each would be flown by a pilot trained in a system that produced aviators faster than combat could consume them. Against such an opponent, Germany never had a realistic chance of prevailing in a war of attrition. The airfield at Metz-Frescaty served French military aviation for decades after the war as Base Aérienne Saint-Vingt-Huit, eventually closing in 2011 as military priorities changed. The old German hangars that sheltered Luftwaffe aircraft before the Allied liberation stood as silent witnesses to history. But the fundamental lesson of January 1, 1945, remains relevant to anyone who studies warfare. Wars are not won solely on battlefields. They are won in factories and training centers and logistics depots. They are won by nations that can mobilize their industrial and human resources for sustained conflict. The German pilot who stood at that window in 1945 understood this truth. Surrounded by the evidence of American industrial might, he spoke words that carried no bitterness, no defiance, only recognition of an unavoidable reality. That is what is beating us. Those 7 words explained the outcome of the air war over Europe more clearly than any official report or strategic analysis. They acknowledged what German pilots had sensed for months, but what their leaders in Berlin had refused to admit. The war was lost, not because German pilots lacked skill, or because German aircraft were inferior, or because German tactics were flawed. The war was lost because Germany had challenged an industrial civilization that could turn out aircraft like Ford turned out automobiles, and no amount of courage or determination could overcome that fundamental asymmetry of power.